The things that we share today, this evening, are things that Deborah and I have spent time for most of our lives. The last 15 years or so, 20 years of our lives, we've had a chance to learn about marriage, about families. I have, why don't you go to the next slide, Dave? I have spent since 1990s PhD in sociology, and my focus in sociology was religiosity, religion, and family, and spent a lot of time trying to understand what does it mean to make the best marriage, best family, and how does religion affect people. Deborah, of course, has got her PhD. When we first married, she was working on a PhD and finally was able to get that done. And it was a great blessing to us as she had an opportunity to do a doctorate in clinical psychology and a master's in marriage and family therapy. So, background in terms of our professional world and our family itself. We've been married for about 10 years. This is our marriage picture. Most of you have watched us grow for the last 5 years, but this was 5 years older than that. So we're going to be 10 years in June, and so excited. I was a 45-year-old bachelor when we got married, and spent probably about 10 years online trying to find this perfect spouse, and I found her. And so it just took a little while. So we're excited about that. We were a blended family. Katie and Katya, or Katie and Chloe, were 3 and 2 years old when we got married 10 years ago. And it was a beautiful day. I got wonderful memories of that day, and just love these 3 beautiful women that I have a chance to be connected to in my life. Today, of course, we have this wonderful opportunity to raise the 2 older daughters. We're going through that test right now of teenagers, and what does that mean? And we're just starting, and we get that. So feel free to give a fireside anytime on about raising teenagers, and we'll put you up here and give you a chance to tell us all the ways to do that. And of course, our toddlers, and we love them. So the thing I want to start out tonight is just giving you a little bit of a social science research background. Marriage makes all the difference in the world. And when it comes to all the findings out there, those that are married, just the list goes on in terms of the outcomes. If you're married, you live longer, less illness, recover faster from sickness, have less depression, less anxiety, have lower suicide rates, enjoy greater financial security, are more satisfied with their physical intimacy, have children who grow up to be physically and emotionally healthy, and have children who are less likely to be delinquent. There's just no question about it. The averages are always higher. And so, no matter what is being said out there, the data is very clear in terms of what we know from social science and the power of what marriage does into our lives. So Heavenly Father knows what He's talking about, and the data says it pretty clearly. But, of course, we have problems, and they understand this data as well as anybody, and Heavenly Father is very closely connected. And so as you remember the family, a proclamation on the world, we, the First Presidency and the Council of 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, solemnly proclaim that marriage between a man and a woman is ordained of God, and that the family is central to the Creator's plan for the eternal destiny of His children. We're just going to work our way back and forth.
So one of the main messages that we hope you'll get from tonight is that because this is so important, we have to do our marriage on purpose. We can't go on autopilot. And you can't see, right? And so this is really important because life gets really busy and it's easy to go on autopilot, but it has to be something that we consciously do every day. John, by the way, said this in one of his books: "My marriage thrives when Kim and I remember our covenant to each other. It's incredibly affirming to have a wife who makes me feel that I'm first in her life, who hangs up the phone when I walk in, and who understands that I like to have time alone with her each day. So one of the messages we want to give today is by not going on autopilot and prioritizing our marriage, we want to create an eternal quality within our relationship. We learned in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 19, that eternal is another name for God. So we want to create the kind of quality within our marriage that God enjoys within his marriage relationship. And the kind of marriage required for exaltation is eternal in duration and godlike in quality. So instead of thinking about eternal marriage as a length, eternal as a time, I want you to think of it as godlike, as quality, as well as length as well. So tonight and next time, this is a kind of a 3-part seminar that we're doing in 2 parts. So we're going to cover part 1 and 2, the first half of part 2 tonight. And then February 9th is our next time. You're going to put this on the calendar, I hope. We're going to cover the other half of the presentation. We're going to be looking at 3 ways that we can build our marriages. We're going to be looking at the me, the we, and the thee. So I want you to hang with us at first, because it's kind of daunting to come to a presentation about marriage and you think, okay, great, my spouse is going to hear everything they've got to fix. And the first thing we're going to talk about is what you have to fix and what you have to do. So that may be a little off-putting to go, oh, I got to do some stuff too, but hang with us. So the very first section is the me section. What do I need to do, regardless of whether my spouse is trying to get along with me or not? What do I need to do to have a good relationship? At the individual level, each spouse must contribute to the marriage for it to flourish. So this is what we're calling the me in marriage. What characteristics do I need to do or be? What characteristics do I need to be a better spouse? So we're going to cover 3 areas. Obviously, I'm sure you could think of hundreds. But we're going to cover 3 areas that we kind of have felt over time has been kind of neglected in our general culture. And hopefully you'll feel these are helpful to you. We're going to be talking about the principle of commitment. And when we talk about commitment, I realize most of you are fairly committed to staying married. So I don't want you to think about commitment as whether I'm going to get divorced or not, although it might be in your case. But we want you to think about commitment at a deeper level, a commitment to prioritize the marriage and continue to work and build at it, even if you've been married for 50 years. Okay, and then we'll be talking about resilience and how our own personal resilience and our own trials actually affects our marriage and our spouse, and how as we work to become more personally resilient that it will bless our marriage. And then we're going to talk about the very important topic of forgiveness. Okay, so let's start with commitment here. Okay, this quote by Elder Oaks is one of the foundational quotes that we've kind of used to build this presentation. A good marriage does not require a perfect man or a perfect woman. It only requires a man and woman committed to strive together towards perfection. And that's what we're trying to do here. And we've called this presentation From Striving to Thriving. Yes, we want to strive, but that kind of sounds almost like drudgery, right? So we want to elevate our relationships. If it does feel like striving, if it feels like drudgery, we want to elevate relationships so that we can feel like we're thriving and doing well. So here we have quotes, we have lots of quotes in the presentation. We have stories that other couples have contributed. We'll tell personal stories. You'll probably know more about your bishop and his marriage after this presentation than you ever really wanted to know. But we also have stories from other people because we want, everyone has different experiences. So this is a story that somebody offered to us about commitment. My husband and I have been married over 20 years. Being married has been the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Staying in this relationship continues to be a daily struggle. Each day I try again. There are positives and negatives. I try to be committed to my children and the family we're raising, and this was a verbal interview, and she began to cry at this point. I don't want to be a single parent, and I don't want to be divorced. I don't want to desert my husband, and I don't want to give up. So for this person, certainly the idea of commitment was just, am I even going to stick with this relationship? And that may be the case for some of us. But I want you to think about that concept of the again and again and again, every day, trying again. So commitment in marriage, I've already mentioned this, is not just about deciding to stay in the marriage, it's a deciding to prioritize the marriage relationship. And One author has said, until one is committed, there is hesitancy. And I think you've probably noticed that in your own life, just in basic goals and things you're trying to do. The chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness. The moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. And obviously providence, we're speaking about God here, and that God will assist us in our relationships and the goals that we have for those relationships to become eternal in quality as we fully commit ourselves to that.
So if we think about what commitment, how the world has viewed commitment in the last 50 years, there's been a decline. Not just in marriage, but just in general, right? There's a sense of, well, I can go out and sign a contract and I can always get out of it. So when we think about what does it mean to be committed, the question is well, in a marriage, obviously, ideally, both spouses have that commitment. That's very important. But again, as Deborah talked about earlier, we, as an individual, I can make that commitment no matter what. And I've watched a lot of people go through thick and thin in terms of how they deal with making sure they say, it doesn't matter what, I'm committed, I'm sticking with this. And that's a very important trait individually that we have to learn to be able to develop in our lives. I've always been fascinated in the story of the Book of Mormon and how from the Hebrew culture, the principle of being committed to just a word. Do you remember that story, right, of Zoram? I can't wait to watch that video again and to just kind of see the interaction that took place that night and how the way I kind of view it is that Nephi kind of got on top of Zoram. And remember, as kids, I used to hate this, but my friends would get me down and pin their knees on top of my elbows, and I couldn't move my arms, and then they'd start to hit my chest with the little knuckles. Remember that? Okay. That's what I think that's how Nephi did. Okay, I kind of view it that way, and he just starts pounding on Zoram, and he just starts hitting on nut, and he says, "Hey, buddy, you're going right? You're going with us, aren't you? Yeah, you're going with us." Well, in this case, it's fascinating that the Hebrew culture, all Nephi wanted from him was what? Just the word. And as soon as he said the word, that was it. Didn't have to sign anything, right? And if you look at the culture throughout the Book of Mormon, that's consistent. Even with Captain Moroni, right? He turns to Zerahemnah and he says, "Listen, you tell me you're not going to come back, you guys can leave." Well, that kind of commitment, concept of commitment, has been lost in our culture, and we have to understand, what does that mean? How does that work in marriage? Okay? There's something what I call the loyal trust cycle, and it's very clear in the research that talks about it. When spouses clearly communicate to each other that they are fully committed to honoring their marital vows and that divorce is not an option, they will invest in their marriage with greater confidence, which in turn promotes greater loyalty, commitment, and security. So once those kinds of things are verbalized and communicated, it cycles that marriage up, right? And it continues to help improve that marriage. And so that's a very important key. Now, it's what I call the self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, the opposite of this is also true. In what ways do we secretly or explicitly put our spouses on probation or withhold from them pieces or bigger chunks of ourselves? Right? So I want you to think about that in terms of your own relationships or your future relationships or your grandchildren, your children's relationships in marriage. What is it that as spouses we create, what type of probations do we create on our spouse? And think about that and say, I need to eliminate that kind of thing. Now, when Deborah and I were first married, the relationship we had, that first year was a challenge for us. And one of the things that was happening is that as a single man at age 45, I kind of had my own way before marriage. And so going into the marriage, I had to figure out a lot of things, and I was pretty cocky. And I admit that I put a lot of stress on my wife. Now, she had, coming into the relationship, she had been married previously, and so there was some insecurities that she brought with her, and because of that, she was waiting for me to be the same way. Okay? So in our first marriage, first year, I had to do a lot of things to try to prove that I wasn't going anywhere. And finally, one day, I just turned to her and said, Deborah, and it's probably in the middle of an argument, and I said, Deborah, I'm not going anywhere. You need to understand, I'm not leaving. I'm not going to go, no matter what. And when she saw that sincerity, it was the most interesting thing. It was like a melting. She just finally, I could feel it, I could sense it. And once that was communicated, and she knew I was committed, it was at that point that I knew it could start to grow even more. And that was a powerful lesson for me. And so it was one thing to say that across the altar, but we had to grow together in that relationship and in that feeling and trust. And when that happened, I could tell we could cycle up in this relationship, and it was very powerful for us. Elder Oaks, under the law of the Lord, marriage, like human life, is precious, living thing. If our bodies are sick, we seek to heal them. We do not give up. While there is any prospect of life, we seek healing again and again. The same should be true of our marriages. And if we seek Him, the Lord will help us and to heal us. So it's very important to understand that a marriage is a living thing. And I feel that every day. There are days when I know I am lazy in my marriage. And something will kind of strike in me, a feeling that says, Richard, you need to put Deborah first. You need to step it up. And so I'll get my phone out and I'll send a little text. And I'll say, I love you, honey. I'm sorry you're having a tough day, or I'm happy that you have this success. And those kinds of little things are so important because it's the heartbeat. And we have to remember that the stresses of life cannot overpower just the simple, basic touches of our daily life. And we go through these up and downs, and we just got to remember that it's like that a marriage is like a life, and we have to be able to place our commitments and live our commitments each day so that that marriage continues to grow and flourish and move from striving to thriving. National Study of Marriage, very fascinating study. Wayne Gallagher, University of Chicago, Case of Marriage, 16 years ago. They found that, they were looking at marital happiness, they found that 86% of the couples who initially rated their marriage as either unhappy or very unhappy, and who did not later divorce, 5 years later, said that their marriage was either happy or very happy. Okay, let that sink in. Okay, the vast majority, 9 out of 10 marriages, who said, I can't handle this is really a tough time. 5 years later, they said, this is a great experience. And so, how many divorces can be walked away from if we can just recognize the poor media and the publicity that's out there that says, gosh, you just need to take a break and move on. Marriage is a growing experience, and you work together. Okay? Permanent marital happiness basically is rare among couples that stay together. And I testify that is true. Some of you may have seen this. About a year ago, Richard Paul Evans, famous author, right? He talked about his marriage and the challenges that he had. And he talked about how in the midst of his success of writing and going out and publishing these books, his marriage was failing. And he talked about one particular evening while he was in Atlanta where his wife hung up on him. They had been through a number of arguments. Wife hung up on him. He went in the shower and he just started praying, but he calls it praying, but he said it was yelling to God. And he basically said, you know, what is going on? I can't do this anymore. And he just bottomed out. And he was struggling. And he finally came to him that he needed to be able to just turn and go back home and just, as he prayed, the Lord just said, you can't change her, Richard. You can only change yourself. You can't change her. So the next morning, he gets up, he travels home, he gets home, wife is as cold as can be. Go to bed that night, they're that close to each other, not a word. The next morning he wakes up, he turns to her and he says, what can I do for you, Dad? She goes, what? He said, what can I do for you? He says, go clean the kitchen. Okay? Goes and cleans the kitchen. Next morning, gets up, what can I do for you? Go clean the garage. He says, I was a little irritated about that one. 2 hours later, I clean the garage. Next day, after about 5 days, she turns to him and says, stop! Why are you doing this? So, I just want to put you first. I want you to know that I love you. She says, stop. I said, no, what can I do for you? Oh, okay. So another week or two this happened. Finally, after about the third week, she finally turns and says, stop doing this. I'm the problem, not you. She says, I am so hard to live with. And he just continued to work with her, says, that's fine, but what can I do for you? And so finally, that day, she turned and says, just hold me, just be close to me. And from that point of experience. So, the walls between us fell. We began a meaningful discussion at what we wanted for life and how we could make each other happier. No, we didn't solve all the problems. I can't even say that we never fought again, but the nature of our fights changed. Not only were they becoming more and more rare, they lacked the energy they once had. We deprived them of oxygen. We just didn't have it in us to hurt each other anymore. Carrie and I have now been married for more than 30 years. I now not only love my wife, I like her. We've learned how to take care of each other, and more importantly, regain the desire to do so.
I think the concept of liking our spouse is a really important one. We've talked about that a lot at home. Richard has a little fun game he plays with our 6-year-old Truman. And he'll say, I love you, Daddy. And he'll say, I like you too. And I actually think that's probably the bigger compliment. If we can say to our spouse, I love you, but I also like you, I think that's a really cool thing. So I just want to touch on that and let you think about that idea of liking each other too. We're going to move on to resilience. And resilience is the ability to maintain or regain positive mental health in the face of adversity. So here's a story that was shared with us. I grew up in a very troubled alcoholic family that very nearly took me apart emotionally over the years. Somehow I stayed the course and pushed forward. I think there was in me a certain level of natural resilience. Knowing who I am helps me to act accordingly even when I am suffering. My wife and I have been married 46 years and have children and grandchildren. We have faced some difficult challenges. I've tried to remember that, quote, I did it for years as a child and a youth, and I can continue to do it if that is my choice. It is my choice, and I will do it. And some of the challenges they had grandchildren pass away and other such things that were very difficult in their lives. And then he continued to say this, when I face hard times, even now, I still cry and sometimes feel doubtful of myself. I remind my wife and family around me that we can and will be able to go on if each draws upon his or her own strength and faith and then decides to go forth. Hand in hand we do it. That is how it has helped me in marriage and family life as we have faced our challenges. The road is still bumpy, but continues forward. So we each have trials. We have a lot of trials, more than we would prefer to have. I know that we're not alone in that. And our ability to handle trials, even if they're not trials between us as a couple, if they're just personal trials, something with our employment or, our health or something, the ability we have to be resilient in those trials affects our spouse and affects the quality of our relationship. So we know a lot about trial from Joseph Smith as he spent time in Liberty Jail. And we know in Doctrine and Covenants 122, verse 7, the Lord tells him, Know thou, my son, that all these things shall give thee experience and shall be for thy good. Jeffrey R. Holland gave a wonderful talk in 2008 And he talked about Liberty Jail as a temple prison experience. I don't know if you remember that. And he talked about the temple aspect of receiving revelation. And he said this: you can have sacred, revelatory, profoundly instructive experiences with the Lord in any situation that you're in. Indeed, you can have sacred, revelatory, profoundly instructive experiences with the Lord in the most miserable experiences of your life. So some time ago, I had a very difficult trial. My husband became very busy, and I was really getting overwhelmed with the burdens of my life. And I started to really tank. In fact, the word I used was drown. I'm drowning. I kept saying this to him: I'm drowning. I can't do this. I can't do this. Does this sound familiar? Have any of you ever felt like that in your life? And it began to take a toll on him. It had nothing to do with our relationship in the sense of any kind of conflict with us, but because I was struggling so much, he would worry about coming home after work. What's he going to find? Do you ever related to that, perhaps? And it really started to take a toll on our marriage, the stress that I was experiencing, because I was not being very resilient at that time. And then I had this dream that I want to share with you. And I was on a large ship like the Titanic, and as did the Titanic, the ship was sinking. I was on a lower level of the ship, sitting in a seat confined by a seatbelt, such as if I had been seated on an airplane. The ocean water had risen so that I had to stretch my chin as high up in the air as I possibly could in order to stay above the water. In one moment, the water would rise again and I would drown. And I felt intense panic. So you can imagine that, right? Here I am, chin's way up here, the water's here. And I know that there's just one moment before it's all over, okay? Then in one aha moment, I realized there was an upper deck to the ship and that I didn't need to drown at that very moment. Immediately upon having that thought, I found myself standing on the upper deck of the great ship. As the ship continued sinking, Richard was moving quickly back and forth, assisting others, appearing not to see me. Yet I felt calm and patient now that I was no longer drowning myself. I knew I was still in danger as the ship continued to sink, but somehow it was okay. I knew Richard would eventually get to me. I got lots of typos there, sorry. And that I felt proud of him for his service to others. And that dream was really important because with that experience, I realized, wait a minute, I'm not in a powerless position where I'm just going to be victim to my circumstance, that I can actually do some things. And so after that dream, I took some very proactive measures to make some differences in my life. Some of that included hiring a babysitter for a couple of hours a week. And I did some other things structurally in my life to try to ease some burdens that I could start to regain that sense of emotional stability and even resilience that I had had previously. And Richard would be the first to tell you, it made the biggest difference for him that I was able to do that. And it not only helped him and relieved his stress, but then it started to allow us as a couple to start to kind of grow together again rather than feeling like we were in crisis mode all the time. So my ability to regain my mental health in that time and have some resilience affected him positively, and it strengthened our marriage as well. So Jeffrey R. Holland continued in this talk to kind of summarize that. Every experience can become a redemptive experience if we remain bonded to our Father in heaven through it. These difficult lessons teach us that man's extremity is God's opportunity. And I think that's really important because we're all going to suffer. We all have trials. And to know that God is using those moments of extremity to seek to teach and bless us. And as we're all familiar probably with the scripture in 1 Nephi, for behold, I refined thee, I've chosen thee in the furnace of affliction. And so there is purpose to these trials that we experience. So one way that I like to think about resilience is I like to think about it as hope. And that as we maintain hope in each of our circumstances, that allows us then to continue to act and to move forward, and it promotes that resilience. God sees everything, and He has contingency plans to get us to where He wants us to be. We often think that our plan's the right way, and then if a trial comes and it thwarts our plan, whatever's happening now must be plan B, which of course is not going to be as good as the plan I had planned, right? And our plan A is not God's plan A. And we tend to think, well, this isn't really the way it's supposed to be, and I've obviously lost the greater blessing. And that's just not the case. That our Father in heaven is an omnipotent, loving God. He knows and sees all, and He knows where He wants to get us. And sometimes it's through a path that we don't anticipate. So one of my favorite quotes, you'll see there's no author on this quote. Go back on. This last quote, God draws straight with crooked lines, I learned about that quote from one of my colleagues who learned this from someone in drug rehab. And that was their great insight that they learned through their experiences with substance abuse and the difficulty of trying to get treatment and the difficulty with, obviously, for those of you familiar with substance abuse, there's a lot of relapse, and it's a very long, arduous process to try to recover from that. And so he had learned in his life that God draws straight with crooked lines. And I've always remembered that, and that's always been comforting to me, that what I think is crooked, and that could not possibly be what God wanted for me in my life. I have to realize this is what He is using to get me where He wants me to go.